The air is thick with smoke and the rhythmic thud of rotor blades. Below you is chaos, but it's the wrong kind of chaos. It's not the frantic ballet of combat you've been trained for. It is the cold, methodical work of murder. The people on the ground wearing your uniform are not fighting an enemy. They are executing civilians. And you, circling 1,000 feet above in a bubble of plexiglass and steel, face a question that has no chapter in any military field manual. What is the chain of command for a conscience? What do you do when the monsters are your own men, and your only weapon against them is to be willing to kill them yourself? His name was Hugh Thompson Jr, and he was no rebel. If you were casting a patriotic American soldier in a film, you would cast someone who looked and sounded just like him. He was born and raised in Stone Mountain, Georgia, a descendant of sharecroppers, part of the bedrock of the American South. He was a devout Christian, teaching Sunday school in his spare time. He joined the Navy right out of high school in 1961, serving with a CB construction battalion. But he was ambitious. He wanted something more. He wanted to fly. So in 1966, he left the Navy, joined the Army, and entered the Warrant Officer Flight Program. Hugh Thompson wasn't an activist. He wasn't a dissenter. He was a believer. He believed in his country, and he believed in the mission. When he was sent to Vietnam in December of 1967, he went as a man convinced of the righteousness of the cause. His home in the sky was an OH-23 Raven, a nimble, almost delicate-looking machine nicknamed the Loach, a light observation helicopter. His job, as part of Company B of the 123rd Aviation Battalion, was one of the most dangerous in the war. He and his two-man crew were the bait. They flew low and fast over the jungle, their mission to intentionally draw enemy fire. Once they located the enemy, they would pop smoke on the position and call in the Sharks, the Cobra gunships circling overhead, to annihilate the target. Thompson was good at his job. He had an uncanny instinct for survival, a sixth sense for the rhythms of the jungle and the breath of the enemy. On his crew were two young men who trusted him with their lives. His crew chief, Specialist Glenn Andriata, a sharp 20-year-old from St. Louis, and his door gunner, Specialist Lawrence Colburn, an 18-year-old from Washington, wise and steady beyond his years. Together, they were a tight unit, a family at 1,500 feet. They had seen combat. They had dodged bullets. They had watched men die. They thought they had seen it all. They were wrong. The morning of March 16, 1968, began like any other. The briefing was clear. U.S. intelligence believed the 48th Viet Cong Battalion had taken refuge in a cluster of hamlets in Son Tin District. One of those hamlets was designated on American military maps as My Lai 4. The men of Charlie Company, part of a larger unit called Task Force Barker, were being sent in on the ground. Thompson's orders were simple: provide reconnaissance and air support, fly ahead of the infantry, find the enemy, and mark them for destruction. The ground troops were told to expect heavy resistance. They were told that all innocents, civilians, would have gone to the market by 7 a.m., and that anyone remaining was either a Viet Cong sympathizer or an active combatant. It was an intelligence failure of catastrophic proportions, a fiction that would be paid for in blood. As Thompson's Loach approached the landing zone just outside My Lai, a strange, unnatural silence greeted him. No enemy fire, no tracers reaching up for his helicopter. Nothing. The artillery preparation had stopped. The first wave of troops had already landed. Over the radio, Thompson was expecting reports of contact. Instead, he heard only quiet. It was the first clue that something was profoundly wrong. He pushed his cyclic stick forward, guiding the Raven over the village. The mission had begun. But he wasn't flying into a battle. He was descending into a grave. Below them, My Lai 4 was quiet. There were no men of military age, no Viet Cong flags, no bunkers firing back. All Thompson could see were women, children, and old men, scattered, terrified. They weren't fighting. They weren't hiding weapons. They were just there, living. And then they started dying. From his vantage point, Thompson saw the American soldiers entering the village. And they weren't clearing houses. They were methodically, calmly, going from hut to hut, pulling people out and shooting them. They were tossing grenades into homes filled with families. Thompson, Colburn, and Andreatta could only watch in mute, sickening disbelief. This wasn't war. This was something else. This was pest control. His radio crackled. He reported what he was seeing. An officer on the ground assured him it was a legitimate military operation. But his eyes told him a different story. Then he saw it. A young Vietnamese woman, maybe in her early 20s, lying wounded but alive in a rice paddy. She was moving. Thompson swooped his helicopter down. He couldn't land, but he could mark her. He told Colburn to toss a green smoke canister next to her. It was a universal signal in the field. Wounded person, non-combatant, needs medical help. He pulled his helicopter up and hovered, assuming a medic would arrive. He watched as a U.S. Army captain approached the smoke. The captain was Ernest Medina, the commanding officer of Charlie Company. He nudged the woman with his foot. He took a step back, and he shot her, point blank. Inside the cockpit, a switch flipped in Hugh Thompson's mind. The confusion evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, searing rage. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't collateral damage. This was policy. "My God," he yelled over the intercom to his crew. "He just killed her." He pushed the Loach around for another pass. And that's when he saw the ditch. It was an irrigation ditch on the eastern side of the village. It was filled with bodies. Dozens and dozens of them. Old men, women, toddlers, infants. A tangled, bloody pile of humanity. And standing over the ditch were American soldiers from the 1st Platoon. As Thompson watched, they opened fire again, firing round after round into the writhing pile, finishing off anyone who still showed a flicker of life. This was a breaking point, a moral event horizon. Thompson couldn't stay in the air. He couldn't be a spectator. He slammed his helicopter down, landing just yards from the ditch. Leaving Colburn and Andreatta to cover him, he jumped out, his flight helmet still on, and ran toward the soldiers. He found a sergeant. He demanded to know what was happening. Why were they killing these people? The sergeant, a man later identified as David Mitchell, replied casually that he was just following orders. Thompson saw movement in the ditch. There were still people alive down there. "There are kids in there," he pleaded. "We can get them out. We can help them." The sergeant looked at him with empty eyes. "We'll help them," he said, "out of their misery." Thompson, powerless, returned to his helicopter. As he lifted off, he heard another single shot from the ditch. The sergeant keeping his promise. Flying away, his mind was a whirlwind of horror and fury. He was an instrument of the United States Army. He was a warrant officer. He had sworn an oath. But to what? To this? To the murder of children? His duty to the Army was now in direct, violent conflict with his duty as a human being. It was in that moment that he saw a second group. About a dozen terrified civilians, mostly women and children, running from a small band of American troops. The civilians scrambled into a crude earthen bunker, the kind normally used as a bomb shelter. The American soldiers were closing in. They were setting up to assault the bunker. Thompson knew with absolute certainty what was about to happen. They would throw a grenade in, or they would just spray the opening with automatic fire, and another 10 or 12 souls would be extinguished. And Hugh Thompson made his choice. He wasn't going to let it happen. Not again. Not on his watch. He barked an order to Andreatta and Colburn. "See that bunker down there, with the GIs coming up on it? We're gonna get those people out." He wrenched the helicopter around, flying directly into the path of the advancing American soldiers. He landed the Loach right in front of them, its skids sinking into the soft earth, its blades kicking up a storm of grass and dirt. He placed his tiny observation helicopter, his own body, squarely between the guns of his countrymen and the lives of the people they were about to kill. He jumped out and strode towards the lieutenant in command of the soldiers, a young man named Stephen Brooks. The tension was thick enough to taste. The roar of the engine, the stares of the soldiers, the fear in the bunker behind him. This was the point of no return. Before he left his cockpit, Thompson had looked at his 18-year-old door gunner, Larry Colburn. He gave him an order that would echo through history, an order that encapsulates the entire moral insanity of the day. "If those sons of bitches open up on these people," he said, pointing to the GIs, "you open up on them. Promise me." Colburn didn't hesitate. "You got it, boss." There he stood, Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, facing Lieutenant Stephen Brooks, an American officer versus an American officer, in a field of slaughter, thousands of miles from home. Thompson told Brooks to hold his men. Brooks argued back. These were military orders. Thompson didn't care. He told Brooks he was going to get the civilians out of the bunker, and that his gunner had them in his sights. The M60 machine gun mounted on the side of Thompson's helicopter, manned by Larry Colburn, was trained directly on the American soldiers. The threat was unspoken, but crystal clear. Any move on that bunker, and an American helicopter would open fire on American infantry. It was a moment of mutiny, of treason, and of breathtaking moral courage. Lieutenant Brooks, outranked and outpositioned, stood down. While Thompson kept the soldiers at bay, his crew chief, Glenn Andreatta, climbed out of the helicopter, armed with only a pistol. He walked to the bunker and gently, carefully, coaxed the terrified civilians out, one by one. Women, children, an old man, sobbing, trembling, but alive. Thompson got on his radio and called for help, not for combat support, but for an evacuation. He lied, saying he had a group of civilians pinned down by crossfire. He requested an armed gunship, not to fight, but to act as a transport. 2 larger helicopters arrived and the civilians were loaded on. Before he left, Andreatta waded into the massacre ditch. Rummaging through the dead, he found one small child, a boy of about 7 or 8, alive, unharmed, clinging to the body of his dead mother. He lifted the boy out, covered in the blood of his family, and handed him up to Thompson in the cockpit. They flew the boy to a nearby hospital in Quang Ngai. Hugh Thompson had stared into the abyss of his own army, and he had not blinked. He had done the unthinkable. He had aimed his guns at his own. When Hugh Thompson landed back at base, he was vibrating with rage. He slammed his helmet on the debriefing officer's desk and demanded to see his commander. In a report he filed that was dripping with fury, he described the unnecessary and hellacious killings, the needless and wanton murder he had witnessed. He made it clear he would not fly again until he knew that the slaughter at My Lai had been stopped. Because of his report, an order was sent to Charlie Company to cease the killing. It is impossible to know how many more lives were saved by that single, furious debriefing. But the story did not end there. In the corridors of power, the machine of self-preservation began to grind into motion. Thompson's official report was sanitized. The official tally from Task Force Barker was a work of pure fiction. 128 enemy killed, 22 civilians dead, caught in a fierce firefight. A commendation was even written for the unit. The My Lai Massacre was not investigated. It was buried. And what of the hero? What of the man who stopped it? Hugh Thompson was not decorated. He was ostracized. He was seen as a troublemaker, the man who broke ranks. The army tried to silence him, not with a gag order, but with dangerous missions. He was ordered to fly as unarmed loach without gunship support, a virtual death sentence. He flew mission after mission, each one an invitation to be shot out of the sky, but he survived. His luck or his skill held. It would take over a year for the truth to begin to crawl into the light. Another soldier, Ron Ridenhour, who had heard graphic stories of the massacre from members of Charlie Company, began his own private investigation. He wrote a detailed letter and sent it to 30 members of Congress. The story broke. The cover-up shattered. The world learned the name My Lai. Suddenly, Hugh Thompson was no longer a forgotten problem. He became the star witness for the prosecution. The army he had tried to save from its own worst impulses now turned on him. He was subjected to hours of hostile questioning by congressional committees. Representative Mendel Rivers, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, tried to paint Thompson as the villain, the man who would turn on his own troops, who threatened loyal American boys. He was an inconvenience to the narrative, a crack in the monolith of military honor. Back home, his life was made a living hell. He received death threats. Garbage was dumped on his porch. People would call his house in the middle of the night and whisper, "Traitor," before hanging up. Animals were left mutilated on his doorstep. This was his reward for an act of unparalleled conscience. He suffered from PTSD, alcoholism, and the crushing weight of being a hero that his country wanted to forget, or worse, condemn. For 30 years, the official story remained one of shame for My Lai, but silence for the men who stopped it. Glenn Andreatta, who pulled the living from among the dead, was killed in action just 3 weeks later. His bravery went unrecorded. Larry Colburn stood by Thompson's side through it all, a lone voice of support. Finally, in 1998, 3 decades after the fact, the U.S. Army was forced to confront its own history. In a quiet, long overdue ceremony, Hugh Thompson, Lawrence Colburn, and Glenn Andreatta, posthumously, were awarded the Soldier's Medal, the highest award the Army can bestow for bravery not involving direct conflict with an enemy. The enemy, in this case, had been themselves. Hugh Thompson's legacy is complex because it forces us to ask a difficult question. What is true loyalty? Is it allegiance to a flag, to an order, to a uniform, no matter the command? Or is it a higher loyalty, an allegiance to the fundamental principles of human decency, the very principles that a nation and its army are supposed to defend? Thompson never saw himself as a pacifist or a protester. He saw himself as a soldier who understood that the moment you surrender your conscience, the war is already lost. He wasn't a traitor to the U.S. Army. He was a testament to what the U.S. Army should always strive to be. He reminds us that true honor is not found in following orders, but in the courage to defy the ones that are inhuman. This file is now closed, but the archives are vast. To be the first to know when the next dossier is opened, subscribe to Federal Confidential and turn on notifications. In the comments below, let us know which secret story needs to be told next.